We're pawnbrokers that happen to be on TV. The uniqueness of our situation is the American Jewelry and Loan business.
5 seasons of raw, unscripted chaos. One pawn shop on 8 Mile Road in Detroit became appointment television. No velvet rope celebrities, no rare historical artifacts changing hands for 6 figures. Just real people, real arguments, and a family business that somehow turned into one of the biggest hits in cable history. While Pawn Stars out in Las Vegas built its audience around rare coins and dusty antiques, Hardcore Pawn built its audience around something raw, human tempers boiling over a counter. Security guards hauling out screaming customers. A father and his 2 grown children clashing on camera as much as they clashed with the public. The show turned Les Gold, his daughter Ashley, and his son Seth into unlikely reality television stars, and it turned a handful of employees, a security chief, a merchandise clerk, a longtime store manager, into recognizable faces as well. Then, just as quickly as it had exploded, it was gone. Cancelled, rebranded around, and largely forgotten by a network that decided drama wasn't its brand anymore. But the story didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Some cast members rebuilt quietly. Some reinvented themselves in ways nobody expected. And at least one of them ended up in a very different kind of spotlight altogether. This is where they are now. The story of Hardcore Pawn actually starts more than a decade before it ever aired. In the late 1990s, a television producer happened to catch a local commercial airing during the Jerry Springer Show. It featured a Detroit pawnbroker named Les Gold, pitching his shop, American Jewelry and Loan, with a kind of blunt, no-nonsense charisma that's hard to fake on camera. The producer filed the memory away. It would be more than 10 years before that flicker of an idea turned into an actual television show. By 2009, the concept had finally found a home at True TV, and on August 16, 2010, Hardcore Pawn premiered. It didn't creep onto the schedule quietly. It launched with roughly 2 million viewers on its debut night, instantly becoming the most-watched series premiere in the network's history at that point. Audiences weren't tuning in for appraisals of rare guitars or vintage firearms. They were tuning in to watch real disputes over money unfold in real time, inside a business that had been a fixture of Detroit for decades. American Jewelry and Loan wasn't built for television. It had been operating since 1978, originally out of a modest storefront, before relocating in the early 1990s to a sprawling building on 8 Mile Road that could handle the volume of a business seeing hundreds of customers walk through its doors on a typical day. That volume was exactly what gave the show its raw material. With that much foot traffic, tempers were bound to flare, and the cameras were there to catch every second of it. What set Hardcore Pawn apart from its more polished cousin, Pawn Stars, was its willingness to let the ugliness show. Customers cursed at staff. Deals fell apart mid-negotiation. Security had to physically remove people on more than one occasion. Les Gold leaned into that reputation rather than running from it, arguing publicly that the show was simply an honest reflection of what it's actually like to run a pawn shop in a city where money is often tight and patience is often thin. For a while, that honesty, or at least the appearance of it, paid off enormously. By the middle of its run, the show was consistently pulling in several million viewers per episode, and its season finales drew some of the largest audiences True TV had ever seen for an unscripted program. It became a genuine ratings powerhouse on cable, dominating its weekly time slot. But nothing in reality television stays hot forever, and by 2014 the cracks were showing. Ratings that had once felt unstoppable started to slide. Longtime viewers began voicing suspicions that scenes were being manufactured rather than captured, and at least one national publication publicly questioned how much of what aired was genuinely spontaneous. The Gold family pushed back against those accusations, but the perception lingered, and it coincided with a broader shift happening behind the scenes at the network itself. New leadership at True TV wanted to move away from conflict-driven programming entirely, pivoting instead toward comedy formats. Within a couple of years, the network had rebranded itself around lighter fare, and there was simply no room left on the schedule for a show built on shouting matches at a pawn counter. Hardcore Pawn wrapped its run in 2015, and its cast scattered in every direction imaginable. If anyone was going to keep the pawn business running after the show ended, it was always going to be Les Gold. He wasn't a television personality who happened to own a pawn shop. He was a pawnbroker who happened to end up on television, and that distinction mattered once the cameras packed up. Rather than fading into retirement, Les spent the years after Hardcore Pawn expanding his footprint in and around Detroit. Even while plenty of small businesses were struggling to stay afloat in the years following the pandemic, Les was doing the opposite, opening new store locations rather than closing them. He'd been talking about growing beyond his original 8 Mile Road flagship for years before he actually pulled the trigger, and when commercial real estate prices dropped to some of their lowest points in decades, he saw an opening. Property owners were suddenly far more willing to negotiate, and Les, along with his son, Seth, used the recognition the family had built through the show to secure favorable lease terms on new locations. Developers, it turned out, were happy to have a recognizable name anchoring their properties. The expansion ultimately added a meaningful number of new jobs to the region, all built around the same direct, in-your-face negotiating style that had made the original store, and the show built around it, so distinctive. Les also found ways to reintroduce himself to audiences that had nothing to do with pawnbroking. In a genuinely surprising turn, he appeared as a competitor on a Food Network cooking competition, taking on professional chefs in a high-pressure culinary challenge. It wasn't as random as it looked on the surface. Les had actually learned to cook out of necessity as a kid, since his parents worked long hours at his own grandfather's pawn shop and he was often left to fend for himself in the kitchen. His grandfather had also passed down traditional Mediterranean recipes that stuck with him well into adulthood, and those skills ended up serving him surprisingly well on the show. He didn't walk away with a win, but he approached the competition the same way he approached a negotiation at the pawn counter. Quick decisions, no visible panic, and total confidence in his own instincts. He's also used his platform for philanthropy. At one point, Les hosted a charity auction inside his flagship Detroit store to benefit a local energy assistance fund, auctioning off dozens of items donated by athletes and local celebrities. When the total raised fell just short of a round number by the end of the night, Les quietly topped it off himself rather than making an announcement about it. A small gesture, but one consistent with how he's described his motivations for years. Less about the spotlight, more about actually helping people get through a hard Michigan winter. Along the way, rumors occasionally circulated online suggesting Les had gone bankrupt, largely traced back to a real incident in which he lost a substantial sum of money to a business scam. It was a genuine setback, but not one that came close to sinking him. In the years since, his net worth has remained solidly in the multi-million-dollar range. His shops have stayed open and expanded, and he even became a published author, with a memoir that climbed into the upper reaches of the New York Times bestseller list. For a man in his 70s, Les Gold shows very little interest in slowing down. If Les represents the old-school soul of American jewelry and loan, his son Seth represents its future. Seth joined the family business in the late 2000s, just before the show launched, and he arrived with a very different perspective than his father's. Les had built the business on decades of face-to-face relationships and old-fashioned negotiation. Seth looked at the operation and saw a business with almost no presence in the digital world at a moment when everything was shifting online, and he decided that needed to change. He launched the company's first e-commerce platform, a genuinely risky move at a time when most pawn shops were still built entirely around walk-in foot traffic. It paid off. Within several years, online sales had grown to represent a significant chunk of the business's total revenue, fundamentally changing how the store operated. A physical storefront can only stay open so many hours a day. An online store never has to close its doors. That shift helped fuel further expansion, with new locations opening in the years that followed, and the company settling into a pattern of strong annual growth that pushed total revenue solidly into the millions. Seth's contributions to the industry didn't go unnoticed. In 2013, he was named National Pawnbroker of the Year at the industry's National Expo in Las Vegas, the highest honor a pawnbroker can receive. It wasn't just about sales figures. Seth had spent years working to reshape public perception of the pawn industry, pushing for more thoughtful media coverage, stronger ties to the local community, and more modern business practices across the board. There was also a quieter significance to the award. Seth won it in a category his own father, a genuine legend in the pawn world, had never claimed. It was, in its own way, a passing of the torch. Seth also used his position to launch initiatives that went beyond the bottom line. He partnered with a colleague to start a jobs program designed specifically to connect people with autism to meaningful employment, built around identifying individual strengths rather than relying on traditional hiring criteria. The program opened a training center inside the pawn shop itself and brought on employees who might otherwise have struggled to find steady work, matching their specific skills, photography, digital editing, and similar talents, to real tasks within the business. He kept innovating on the operational side as well, later launching an online loan renewal and payment service that let customers manage their pawn loans without needing to physically visit the store. It reflected a consistent theme in Seth's approach, honoring what had always worked about the family business while dragging it, deliberately and successfully, into the modern era. Of the three Golds who anchored the show, Ashley's story is arguably the most personal. She was there from the very first episode, working alongside her father and brother inside the massive 8 Mile Road store, and to viewers she appeared to be thriving in the chaos. Sharp, quick-tempered when she needed to be, fully capable of holding her own in a business that didn't leave much room for softness. Behind the scenes, though, the reality was heavier. By her own account in interviews after the show ended, she reached a genuine breaking point. The days had started to blur together into an exhausting sameness, waking up, putting on the same clothes, running through the same routine, and she began to notice her health and her personal relationships suffering under the weight of it. There had also always been friction between her and her father on set, tension that didn't disappear once the cameras stopped rolling. Add in her brother's more modern approach to the business clashing with their father's traditional instincts, and Ashley often found herself caught in the middle of a family dynamic that played out publicly for years. Eventually, she decided she didn't want to spend the rest of her life known only as Les Gold's daughter. So she walked away, and almost immediately started building something of her own. Not long after leaving the family shop, she launched an online jewelry business built entirely around pieces she personally selected, sourcing new styles from around the country. Her inventory ranged from affordable costume pieces to fine jewelry worth thousands of dollars, and she leaned into her own developed eye for style, eventually dressing celebrity clients and building a loyal customer base well beyond Detroit. A few years later, she rebranded the business under her own name and entered, and won, a pitch competition run by a Detroit fashion incubator. By that point, she had already made the media rounds, appearing on major national outlets to talk about fashion and her post-hardcore pawn life. She also launched her own podcast, where she talks with guests about style and personal stories, and where she's become noticeably more candid about her time on The Family Show. She hasn't spilled every detail, but she has acknowledged publicly what many viewers had long suspected, that certain moments on Hardcore Pawn were shaped or nudged along by producers looking for conflict, a claim echoed by other former cast members as well. When the pandemic hit in 2020, Ashley's life shifted again, this time towards something quieter. With her kids suddenly home from school, she found herself helping them through remote learning while continuing to run her business. No longer working the grueling hours the pawn shop had once demanded, no longer filming constantly, but finally able to build a life with room in it for her family. For Ashley, walking away from Hardcore Pawn wasn't really about leaving the business world behind. It was about building one on her own terms. Few moments on Hardcore Pawn hit harder than the fallout between Les Gold and longtime employee Rich Pyle. Rich had worked at American Jewelry and Loan for roughly 2.5 decades before the show ever existed, rising to become one of its most recognizable faces once cameras started rolling, instantly identifiable by his spiked hair, goatee, and unshakable confidence on the sales floor. That all came crashing down when an internal audit raised serious concerns about how Rich had been using company resources, including allegations involving personal use of company credit cards and inflated reimbursement claims. Les confronted him directly, and the confrontation happened on camera. Rich didn't take the accusations quietly, at one point arguing that his decades of loyalty to the business should count for more than any single mistake, a claim that, by most accounts, only made the situation worse. Les fired him on the spot. Rich came back the next day hoping to salvage things, and Seth tried to broker a meeting on his behalf, arguing that the shop still needed Rich's product knowledge and rapport with regular customers. Les wouldn't budge. The meeting was over almost as quickly as it started, and Rich was written out of the show entirely not long after. He relocated to Los Angeles and tried his hand at running his own gold-buying business, but it never quite took off the way the pawn shop had. His actual second act arrived from an unexpected direction. In the years that followed, he became the host of a television series following the American Cornhole organization on tour, bringing the same brash, high-energy personality that had made him a fan favorite on Hardcore Pawn into a completely different arena. His wife has helped behind the scenes on the production side as well. It's a smaller stage than national cable reality television, but it's given Rich a way back into the spotlight, on his own terms this time. Not every Hardcore Pawn cast member set out to be on television at all. Bobby Janik was originally hired for a fairly unglamorous role, handling merchandise, largely t-shirts, right as the show was gearing up to film its first season. He had no idea, walking in that first day, that cameras were already being set up around him and that his job was about to become something much bigger than retail. As filming ramped up, so did Bobby's screen time. What started as incidental background footage slowly turned into a recurring presence, and once Rich Pyle exited the show, Bobby stepped naturally into more of a featured role. Producers noticed his energy translated well on camera and offered him a bigger part, which he accepted. He ended up staying with the pawn shop for a couple of years even after filming Wrapped, before eventually leaving the business behind entirely and never looking back. In the years since, Bobby has been fairly open, sometimes bluntly so, about what filming a heavily produced reality show was actually like. He's spoken in interviews and on social media about how the show consistently prioritized drama and conflict over strict authenticity, echoing similar comments from other former castmates. He's also been candid about how little cast members like himself were compensated relative to the audience the show brought in, describing a dynamic where producers leaned on the idea of exposure and a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity rather than offering competitive pay. On top of that, he's talked about the pressure of essentially being expected to perform a version of himself even when the cameras weren't technically rolling, a dynamic that wore on him over time. After leaving the pawn business, Bobby landed a genuinely lucrative opportunity as a brand spokesperson for a major automotive maintenance company, a role built around the same on-camera charisma that had made him popular on Hardcore Pawn. He appeared at trade shows, starred in a long run of commercials, and used social media to help grow the brand's retail footprint significantly. It was, by his own account, a meaningful step up financially from his pawn shop days. Then, in one of the more surprising career pivots to come out of the entire Hardcore Pawn cast, Bobby launched an adult subscription content platform after a stretch of inconsistent voiceover work. He's been direct about the reasoning. It offered him more control and more reliable income than the freelance voiceover jobs he'd been piecing together. The move drew a mixed, sometimes sharply negative reaction from longtime fans of the show, but Bobby has stood by the decision as a straightforward business choice rather than something to be embarrassed about. That chapter of his post-show life did eventually bring some legal trouble. The network that owned Hardcore Pawn sent him a formal cease and desist letter, accusing him of using clips and branding from the show across his personal website and social media without authorization, including in a video series where he revisited old episodes. Bobby ultimately removed the disputed material from his online presence. Whatever else has changed Bobby's arc, from t-shirt clerk to reality TV regular to brand spokesperson to independent content creator, is probably the single most unpredictable journey of anyone connected to Hardcore Pawn. Few Hardcore Pawn storylines were as jarring as the fall of Joel "Big Joe" Shannon. As the store's head of security, Joe had earned a level of trust that went well beyond a typical employer-employee relationship. Les had hired him personally and had even welcomed him into family gatherings outside of work. That trust made it all the more shocking when hidden cameras caught him stealing while filming was underway. Les confronted him directly on camera, visibly shaken by the betrayal from someone he'd considered not just an employee but practically family. Joe was fired on the spot and ultimately faced felony theft charges. It would have been easy for that to be the end of Joe's story, a public scandal, a career-ending moment captured for national television. Instead, he rebuilt. A few years later, he started a small transportation company in the Detroit suburbs, beginning with just a couple of trucks handling local deliveries. Over time, he grew it steadily into a genuine regional logistics operation serving clients across the Midwest. Perhaps the most remarkable part of Joe's story is what happened next. Years after the very public falling out, Seth Gold began contracting Joe's trucking company to handle deliveries between store locations. It wasn't an instant reconciliation. Rebuilding that kind of trust took time, but eventually the two found a way to work together again. Today, Joe employs a solid team of his own and has built a respected reputation as a small business owner in his community. What started out as one of the show's most humiliating moments turned, eventually, into a genuine story of redemption. Not every cast member wanted to stay connected to Hardcore Pawn once the door closed behind them. Fielding Teichman, known on the show simply as Felix, was a fan favorite for his calm, steady presence amid the store's chaos, the guy who never seemed to lose his composure no matter what was happening around him. Then, partway through the show's run, he simply vanished from the screen without much explanation. The real story was a contract dispute. During negotiations for a later season, Felix asked for a raise that reflected his growing role and popularity with viewers. The production company turned him down, talks broke down entirely, and Felix ultimately walked off set mid-filming, leaving the crew scrambling to adjust without much warning. He later tried to reopen negotiations through a lawyer, but by then the show had already moved forward without him, bringing in new security staff to fill the gap. Unlike several of his former castmates, Felix didn't pursue any kind of second act in the public eye. He eventually relocated to Texas and has consistently turned down interview requests in the years since, choosing to leave that chapter of his life behind rather than trying to capitalize on it. In an industry where former reality stars often chase every last bit of lingering relevance, Felix's choice to simply walk away and stay away stands out. Looking back, it's easy to see Hardcore Pawn as just another loud, conflict-driven reality show from cable television's boom years, the kind of program that burns brightly for a few seasons and then quietly disappears. But the lives that unfolded after the cameras stopped rolling tell a more complicated story. Les Gold kept building the business he'd spent a lifetime creating. Seth turned an old-school pawn shop into something genuinely modern. Ashley walked away from a family spotlight to build one entirely her own. Rich Pyle,